Do you even falter to how to be Irish? Today we're going to be talking to Dr. Theresa Reidy. You might recognise her from commentary on different political events in recent years in Ireland. I'm very much looking forward to talking to her, particularly because we have recently enough had a presidential election. I suppose there's been a lot of discussion around it, the candidates or lack of candidates for some people, and of course the historic high when it came to spoiled votes. So we'll be talking a bit about the presidential election, but we're also going to be talking about Irish politics more broadly as well. And as always, if you enjoy this podcast, share it with a friend. It's just me doing this. I really appreciate all the support I can get. And yeah, I want to just thank my listeners who've been with me, who've been there listening to every episode. I know there's a few, so I really appreciate that. Okay, right, let's get into it. Gurmila. Dr. Theresa Reidy is a professor in the Department of Government and Politics at University College Cork. Her primary research focus is voting behaviour at elections and referendums, and she's also conducted research on political parties and political institutions. Her recent work has been published in PS Political Science and Politics, Electoral Studies, Parliamentary Affairs and Politics, and she is a co-editor of several books on Irish elections and Irish politics. Theresa, you're so welcome to the studio today. Thank you so much for coming in.
It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you. So we've obviously had we've had a busy couple of years when it comes to Irish politics and elections. Of course, we had the general election at the end of last year, and then more recently we had the presidential election there. So we might start with that and talk a little bit about what that might mean for Irish politics going forward. Something that really stood out to me from the results of the presidential election was the historic high of spoiled votes. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts as to why this might have happened and also what this might mean for Irish politics going forward.
Yeah, it was a really unusual outcome. You know, at presidential elections, generally have about 1% of the votes are spoiled. And it goes up a bit actually in European Parliament elections, about 4%. But like this is up into double digits. This is a really significant increase, and I think there are different reasons behind it. But at their core, there's a kind of a single idea that the voters weren't happy with the choice that they were presented with, and I think within that there are a lot of people who were unhappy for different reasons. But I suppose it's important to say when we have elections now, voters go into the polling station, they get ballot papers. And there's usually anywhere between kind of 8 and 25 candidates on the ballot paper. So we think about our elections as having a lot of choice. And for the most part, you know, that's how they are. You have to go back to the early 1970s to have an election where you had just 2 candidates on the ballot paper for the presidential election. And so I think there's kind of at its core, voters were really rebelling against the idea that their choice was restricted in the way that it was. I think for some of those people, they felt that the 2 candidates were of the establishment. For some, they felt that their particular ideological preferences weren't on there. We have a large group of people who were just generally very unhappy with the political system and the political parties, all of the parties and independents. And so there are a lot of different strands to it, but fundamentally people were unhappy that they didn't have a wider choice. Now, I think it's important, and I think it's very important that the political parties hear that. But I also think we need to kind of put that in the context of the fact that this was a very unusual election. And actually nobody thought or probably even wanted an election in which the choice was as restricted as it was. And so there's a lot of kind of debate now about whether we need a referendum to change the constitution. I mean, I don't think that's necessary at all. Like we have a nomination process, and the nomination process works. In 2011, 2018, there were 6-7 candidates on the ballot paper. So candidates can get onto the ballot paper. This time around, the political parties made poor choices, and we ended up with very few candidates. But it's a kind of an aberration. It's not a trend. In fact, if anything, the trend had been in the other direction, which was that we would have more and more candidates. And I think political parties are also nothing if not strategic. They will also have realised this time around that it didn't work for them not having more candidates on the ballot paper. And I'd be immensely surprised if they didn't behave in quite a different way 7 years from now when it comes to the next presidential election. I suspect we will have many more candidates on the ballot. So it's not that it doesn't matter. I think it does. I think it speaks to kind of important disconnect between a large proportion of people, and especially people who got up and went out to vote to spoil their vote. That I think that bit's really important. But I think the message, though, needs to be a kind of wider one about people who are disaffected with politics and disenchanted with how things work, rather than kind of focusing in very particularly on the kind of presidential nomination route, which will probably correct itself anyway.
And did the voter turnout as a result also be affected by the fact that there were less candidates than there usually are in the presidential election?
So the voter turnout's interesting because actually we thought voter turnout would be lower. If you look at a pattern of voter turnout kind of going back to the 1950s, there's a very clear downward trend at all elections, not just at presidential elections, but presidential elections have the lowest turnout of all the elections, but they're all going down. And so before the election, there's a lot of discussion about, where do you think turnout is going to be? And so a lot of us would have been quite worried that it would drop even lower than it was in the preceding election in 2018, partially for exactly the reason you said. There are very few candidates. And we know from the research on turnout that the number of candidates is a factor. And the other thing is that the election itself kind of seemed to lose a lot of its fizz as it proceeded. The campaign was quite long with just so much focus on two candidates. There was quite a narrow field. And so for all of those reasons, we thought maybe turnout would dip even lower, but it didn't. It was slightly ahead of where it was in 2018. Now, I wouldn't get too carried away. It was just marginally ahead of where it was, and still more than half of the population didn't vote. But interestingly, it's plateaued in the kind of middle 40s now at presidential elections, and so we'll have to see what happens the next time around. I think probably more seriously, turnout actually declined at the last general election, and it dropped below 60% for the first time. And I think that's a real wake-up call in terms of kind of that wider question that I mentioned about kind of disaffection with politics. But I think there's also an administrative question in there in relation to how we manage our registers, and they're very complicated at the moment. So the Electoral Commission has been established, and it's been doing an awful lot of work to get people onto the register. And you can completely see why they do that. You should enable the people who want to vote. You should make it easier for them to vote. But the work that also needs to happen now is around taking people off the electoral registers who shouldn't be on there. And that has started, but it's much more difficult work to do, actually, because you have to make sure that you only take off the people who shouldn't be on there, people who have emigrated, or if you've gone on somewhere else on the register, you should be taken off. And so you should be very careful that you don't accidentally remove somebody who shouldn't be removed. And so it's kind of laborious and painstaking work. But we do know that there are hundreds of thousands of names on the register that shouldn't be on there. And that's affecting our turnout as well. So it's quite likely the turnout is maybe 4 or 5 points higher than the official statistics record. But that's important, and that's being corrected. But the downward trend is still the same. And there's no doubt that there's that kind of disaffection and sense that people don't think their vote matters, which of course in the Irish system is actually completely untrue. Your vote can be really, really significant because electoral margins are so small and people win and lose on the back of just a handful of votes. So it's rare in voting behaviour and electoral studies that we can say to people that your single vote matters. But in the Irish case, we can. Your single vote can be very important.
And is that because we have proportional representation? Is that the result of that?
Yes, but it's the specific version or the specific type of proportional representation we have, which is the single transferable vote, that often means the electoral margins are really quite small. And so because of that process of transferring votes when candidates are eliminated and distributing surpluses, the count has series of different stages, and decisions at each stage are made sometimes by large margins, but sometimes by quite small margins. So whether somebody stays in the race or gets eliminated can be decided by a relatively small number of votes. So it's the mechanics of how the system works that means that decisions often come down to a kind of a handful of votes. And people may remember it was from the local elections in June of last year. There were two candidates where it was just a single vote put them apart in terms of who got eliminated and who would proceed into the next round. And so there were a couple of recounts. But it does say to somebody, your vote matters. It can have a decisive impact on the outcome of the outcome of.
And I suppose that being said, how do you find that kind of a message lands with the Irish electorate? Like, do you feel like, obviously there's people who are like very interested in politics and they follow it and they watch all the debates and they listen to all of the coverage and all of that. But then there's the people who are kind of going, they interview them for probably these vox pops coming up to elections and they kind of say, oh, I'm not going to bother, Is that something that's always been present? Or is this, you mentioned a trend, is this like a worrying, growing trend that you see?
I mean, I think there has always been a small percentage of people that don't vote. The troubling part is that that group is growing, and so electoral turnout, it was just short of 70% at the 2011 general election, and that was that really kind of momentous election right in the depths of the financial crisis. And last year, in 2024, participation had dropped below 60%. So it had dropped by 10 points in the space of about, kind of just under kind of a decade and a half. And so that is a big drop, actually. And even allowing for the fact that we have these problems with the electoral registers, it means that people are disengaged from politics. They don't feel they have a reason to go out and vote, or that their vote matters or can shape kind of the political world in a real way. And so I think that's important. Now, I think you have to dig into that group a little bit, though, because and we sometimes kind of divide them into two clusters, right? They're a group of people who aren't able to get to the polls for a variety of different reasons. And we've been very slow in Ireland about modernising our electoral procedures. And so it's underway at the moment. But I do think we have to be clear that like stuff that's happening now should have happened 10 or 15 years ago. So it's very hard to get a postal vote. It's a complicated process, and you have to sign documents and get them in by a set date. We could make it much easier for students, for people who are traveling for work, or just somebody who has their holiday booked, and has gone on holidays. They're not entitled to get a postal vote, and they might really want to vote. And so the system should do much more to assist people who want to vote. Like if you go back to the general election last year, I'm sure people who followed politics were sick and tired of it in the end about when would the election be? When would the election be? I mean, when would the election be? Started in March and it went on for the whole year. Like most people don't organise their lives and their holidays around the possible dates for elections. So you could just accidentally be out of the country. So there's a group of people where for caring, for work, for all kinds of reasons. And they might be as many as kind of 5 to 7% of the total. We believe they're a reasonable size of the population, the electorate, who want to vote, but for all kinds of structural reasons couldn't vote. And the reason I emphasize them a lot is actually it's a relatively straightforward thing to fix. We can do things like early voting, like postal voting, that would really help a lot of those people. There's another group, and this is the bigger group, and these are the people who they're not motivated to vote. And they're not motivated to vote for lots of different reasons. They may feel that the political system, has let them down. They may feel that they can't affect the political system, that their personal vote doesn't. They may just simply not know very much about politics. They may be just completely disinterested in politics and not think it's worth the time to engage with it. And that's those are much more difficult issues to address. It's a very straightforward thing to have early voting and you can go down to City Hall and cast your ballot. It's a much more difficult challenge to engage with someone and persuade them that politics does matter to them and that the political system does care about them and that actually their vote does matter and has the capacity to shape politics. And so, that's a lifelong learning issue. It's a lifelong engagement. And it's something, it has to be said, that kind of most democracies are really struggling with. We're not unusual. If anything, actually, we have quite high levels of trust in this country, but it is a challenge, and I think it's there, but I don't see any easy solutions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of like Australia, isn't it compulsory that you have to vote? Or in the States, New York had their mayoral election there recently, and I remember seeing people on TikTok that they go down to the polls early, and I was like, oh, that's so nice. So you can get ahead, get organized. And so, we all have busy lives. Like, you need to, it's part of your life, and it would be nice to be able to like fit it in a little bit easier. I know there was perhaps a story quite a few years ago when the Irish government bought these electronic voting machines and then they didn't work and then they sold them for like a huge loss. So I would like to see them perhaps tackle that in a bit more of a strategic way.
They did work. They did
Oh,
work.
they did work.
We just didn't like them, and I think
Okay.
that, and that's fair too. That's fair too. And it's one of these things where, with the benefit of hindsight, now looking back, actually we may have made the right decision in terms of the integrity of our system and maintaining that kind of trust in the system, because the voting machines worked, but we have a very complicated electoral system. And so the counting process goes on all day and often for 2 days, and people get to see it, and the system is also very open. If you're interested in politics, you can go down to the count centre, you can see all the votes spread out, you can see how they're meticulously examined and counted, and you can see exactly what is happening. Whereas with the voting machines, wheel out this kind of this box and this computer, and somebody presses a couple of buttons, and hey presto, the result comes out. Now, we've no reason to believe, I mean, there's every reason in fact to believe that it was meticulous and that it was correctly done, but it was very different to how we used to do elections. And I think voters weren't kind of willing to make that particular leap. And politicians, I think, were very kind of attuned to that. Our politicians are very close to their voters, but now, when we see so much concern around the world with interference with elections, specifically with interference with election equipment, in the United States in particular, we hear an awful lot about concerns about voting machines. It might have turned out that kind of our attachment to the paper and the pencil might have saved us from some of those kind of concerns about election integrity. That being said, I think there are things that we probably will have to think about into the future. And PRS-TV is a lovely system and we love it in Ireland. But, the count process is very laborious. And we see that especially at the European Parliament elections, where counting can go on for maybe 3 and 4 days. And especially because we have these huge ballot papers, and we may need to think about scanning machines for doing the counting. So we would still vote with pen and paper, and I pencil and paper, in fact. And I think there would still have to be audits, and you would have to do random selections to verify it. But we might need to think about ways of kind of speeding up the counting process. Maybe still doing it in stages, but at the very least, kind of speeding up the count, because it's disadvantaging us actually in the European Parliament side. A lot of our European neighbours, they vote on a Saturday, or some of them even vote on a Sunday. And they get the results Sunday night, and they're off to Brussels 9 o'clock on Monday morning to get the good jobs in the European Parliament and to begin the negotiations for the power balance. We're here in the Midlands still counting until Wednesday. It's completely it's done with such care and attention, and that's really important in terms of maintaining trust. But maybe as our population grows, we used to have total electorates under 2 million. Now it's 3.5 million. Soon it'll be 4 million. The beauty of the system and the time it takes to count the votes, we may have to talk about that trade-off.
I think so. As much as I love the sport of, watching people physically count them, and, you always have those one or two which go to a recount and you're waiting until nearly a week or something like that for the results. It's very enjoyable, but at the same time, how practical is it going forward? I absolutely agree. Um, in terms of the presidential election, I suppose we did see a lot of the left parties come together and support Catherine Connolly. And this is something that's I suppose a little bit unusual in the sense of the left coming together to combine. And there's been a little bit of talk around this since. Do you think this is maybe a bit of a signifier of a shift happening in Irish politics when it comes to the left parties?
I mean, I think it's an important step. We saw for the first time in the Dáil after the 2024 general election a clearer kind of centre left divide in the Dáil, and the parties of the left kind of having a real leadership role in opposition. And I think you saw some coordination around, a lot of people might remember the speaking rights row in the Dáil, around the time that the Dáil was sitting for the first time and electing the Taoiseach. And there was a clear degree of coordination amongst the parties of the left at that time. Now, so this is the second time that we see them kind of coming together. What happened this time around, I suppose, though, was a little bit more organic. I think maybe it might not be the right word, but it certainly came from the ground up. Like Catherine Connolly, entered the race very early on, and she kind of accumulated support throughout the summer from left wing political parties, and Sinn Féin kind of being the kind of final real culmination of that process in September. But I think Catherine Connolly is of the left, but she is an independent. And I think to some extent that made it a little bit easier for the parties of the left to coalesce around her. She wasn't of one of the particular. And I also think in the presidential election, it's much more focused on the individual and the person and what they are going to be like as president. And in that sense, I think for the parties, there was that kind of space to be able to row in behind somebody. Now, what has come out of this that is really important for the future is you now have people within all of these parties who talk to each other at a kind of a structural and at an organizational level. So both at the elite level, but also kind of for campaigning on the ground in constituencies, you have people across the parties that now know each other, that have worked together in a campaign. And I think that's not to be underestimated. It's an important development. But I think we also have to say, though, that the presidential election was the easy bit. There was no policy involved, and at the end of the day, they were all able to get behind one candidate. In a general election, even in a local election, all these parties are going to have their own candidates in the field, and they're all going to be competing against each other, and that competitive dynamic alters the nature of what will happen. I think the other thing is that there are actually important differences between the parties of the left. And it's also, the case that, parties on the left, they take ideology, like it's sincere for them. And I think that has to be said as well. They do have strong views about particular ways that things should be done. And it won't be easy for some of those parties to reach accommodations, because there's quite a span, an ideological span, from kind of people before profit through to maybe the more centre-left parties like the Greens and the Labour Party, which are more on the pragmatic side and have been in government before and have had that experience of kind of compromise to achieve. And so I think, the difficult kind of negotiations lie ahead. And I'm not completely convinced that we will see significant changes before the next general election. I think what we definitely could see, and the groundwork is there for that, is a kind of transfer pact where the parties collectively say, vote for one of us, vote for the left party, and then transfer to other left parties. And that they could do that in a consistent way and do it right from the very beginning. So sometimes you get that kind of loose left transfer pact, but it often doesn't happen until kind of well into the election, and there's always a bit of uncertainty about whether they will or they won't do it. I think you could see a lot of work around that, and that could be achieved without much difficulty. I think where the real challenges are in relation to the idea of a kind of a shared platform. And I think that is critical in terms of presenting themselves to the electorate as a kind of coherent alternative, as a collection of parties that could work together in government. They need to say, not that we have all the same policies. I mean, they're still different parties, but that we have shared principles, or we have a common platform, or, we have a core set of commitments that all of us as parties can sign up to. And then they can have their own manifestos, and of course, whoever does best, there's always kind of negotiation for a programme for government afterwards. But to be reasonably coherent going into the election, and to present the voters with an actual choice, there will need to be policy compromise and policy agreement, and a shared policy or principles document that's presented to the voters.
And I suppose that being said, do you think that there might be a future where the Irish government is not made up of Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, that the other parties do win enough seats in order to have a majority? Do you think there's any trend going in that direction?
I mean, I think across the world, kind of the old big parties of the centre, are experiencing very significant difficulties, and they're in decline in many places. We talk about voter de-alignment, the idea that that kind of connection between the voter and the party has really been contracting. And as the generations pass, the number of people who feel an enduring or close connection to those types of political parties, it's decreasing, and it's shrinking with every new generation. And the big challenge for Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, the most significant challenge they face, is that they're not building new connections with younger generations of people, and that younger generations feel really let down by those parties. And so the kind of, with the passage of time, the kind of direction of travel is fairly evident. Now, nothing is set in politics. Politics is dynamic, and things can change, but the direction internationally, and then more particularly here in Ireland, is certainly that those old big parties that used to dominate politics are really struggling to retain that enduring connection with their voters, and really struggling to build new connections with younger generations of voters. And so in lots of systems, we see kind of growing fragmentation. We see the emergence of smaller parties, or we see small kind of what used to be fringe parties kind of growing up within the system. But it's also true that some of those parties are struggling to build enduring connection, to build that kind of close relationship with voters, where they vote for the party at every election over time. So we have a much more de-aligned electorate now, where voters change who they vote for from one election to the next election. So we get quite volatile results. So I mean, if you predict the future, of course, it's entirely likely that Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, wouldn't be in government at some time, that there will be a further kind of extension of the trend that we see at the moment. But I also do think there's a kind of a worrying tendency at the moment to kind of talk about the way the country has been governed for the last 100 years, and a kind of a presentation of kind of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and that the reason that they governed the state for the last 100 years, there's something kind of nefarious about it, or that there's something wrong with the fact that these two parties governed the country at various different stages. But I mean, Ireland is an old democracy. These parties governed Ireland because that's what the people of Ireland wanted. And I think sometimes there's just the kind of presentation as though that there was something wrong with that, because they were never in government together, of course, until 2020. They always governed separately. But that was the will of the people, and that was the will of the electorate. And so the will of the electorate since the 1970s is that they're less and less enamored with those two parties, and now they're governing together. But and it's likely somebody else may yet govern. But we also need to remember that politics is very dynamic, and we shouldn't assume that the next election would be a coalition of the left. There are other alternatives that don't necessarily involve a coalition of the current big two. I mean, a coalition between Sinn Féin and Fianna Fáil is also a real possibility, and there are kind of key areas of alignment on the national question between those parties. So it's a much more open space than it used to be in the past. But ultimately, it's the voters who will decide.
Absolutely. And is there elements of Irish politics that you believe are uniquely Irish? So something that maybe comes to mind is the idea of independence. And as you mentioned, those kind of close relationships that politicians have with their electorate. Sometimes people might kind of say like, "Oh, I'm voting for Jimmy because I had a chat with him the other day, or I met him down the pub or whatever." Is that something that's unique to Irish politics? And I suppose independence as well. I'm curious about that.
Yeah, the close relationships between Irish politics, between Irish voters and Irish politicians, is a really strong. It's not completely unusual, but it is. It is a distinctive feature of the Irish system. And one of the things, Irish politicians are rooted in their communities. So sometimes you hear people say, but the politicians don't know what's going on and they don't know what the kind of feeling is in the ground. Nothing could be further from the truth, actually. Irish politicians really, across the political spectrum, are rooted in their communities, and they engage extensively with their electorate. And sometimes people like me come along and say, they're spending too much time on local issues and they should be working more on national questions. And I think that's a conversation to be had. But I think, you can say that maybe they should focus a little bit more on national politics, but you can also say that it's a real strength of the system, that kind of openness in the political system and the way in which we can engage with our politicians. So one of the things that's really different in comparison to other countries, and particularly if you live in a big European country, is how easy it is to get to meet your local politician. They run clinics and they're in their communities. And so if you want to ask your local member of parliament a question, the TD is there on a Friday evening or over a weekend, and you can kind of saunter in. And a large numbers of us have met our local politicians. That's really very different in like Germany or France, where politicians, they represent much larger constituencies, much larger groups of people, and the number of people who get to meet their TD is very meet their MP is very much lower. So that is a very distinctive thing about Irish politics, and I think it's a strength, albeit that it's an area that we also have to keep a close eye on in terms of ensuring that politicians stay working on national issues. I think independence. I'm often quite critical of independence because I think they fragment the political system, and a lot of them are quite localist in their orientation, and a lot of the time they're seeking to get particular resources for their constituencies, and contrary to the kind of natural allocation of resources for the kind of country as a whole. So it's kind of more for Kerry, if I may pick on a particular part of the on a particular part of the country, and more for Kerry, or disproportionately more for Kerry, means somewhere else that might be more deserving doesn't get what they should get, and I'm not sure that we should allocate resources on that particular basis. And I think also the fragmentation, if you have lots of independents in the Dáil, they don't come with a coherent platform, a coherent set of policy ideas. And so when it comes to forming government, you have to do individual negotiations with each of them. They don't operate as, that's not their thing. Being an independent is the exact opposite of a party in that sense of the word. But it does mean that you're reliant on these kind of collections of individuals. And if I can also take it back to where we started, we were talking about the presidential election, and it is true that there were votes to put more candidates into the race, and there were independents that didn't use their votes. And I don't fault them for that particularly, but I think we have to be aware of the fact that independents represent very small, niche kind of political areas. They're not organised. They don't operate as a collective. And that has consequences, because politics is a team sport. Actually, it's not an individual sport, and it's about making collective choices for the country as a whole. And when you have lots of individuals operating at the fringe, it makes it more difficult to engage in collective action. And so independents are a challenge within the system, and I understand that there are some people who will only vote for independents, but we should be aware of how unusual they are. I mean, the vast majority of all the non-party TDs, all the independents in Europe, are in Ireland. Most other European countries don't have independents. In some countries, there's just no way of them being elected at national level. Of course, you can have them at local level, but not at national level, because they have national party lists, and the electoral system doesn't facilitate them being elected. So in the Irish case, I think some of them bring strengths into the system, and undoubtedly some of them have brought issues onto the national agenda that otherwise would not have been the case. And I think particularly of people like Tony Gregory and Maureen O'Sullivan, and marvellous work that they did for what were really very disadvantaged communities in Dublin. But if we take kind of independence as a cluster, they do have downsides, particularly in relation to kind of the fragmentation, making it more difficult to make political decisions, more difficult to get governments. And in the case of the presidential election, we saw it's very difficult for them to come together as groups to make decisions within the system.
And has it always been a very big part of Irish politics that we've had that large amount of independence compared to other countries?
Yeah, we've always had more independence than other countries. They're not really strong feature of politics in other European countries. Now, there are other parts of the world where they do have them. They have some in Canada and Nunavut and some of the Pacific Islands. So they're not a completely distinctive feature to the Irish system, but they are rare in European parliaments. European politics tends to be kind of mostly located and rooted around political parties. So that bit of them is distinctive, and they are very much like a function of kind of the combination of our kind of local political culture and emphasis on the local, and the electoral system facilitates them then as well.
Okay, I see. That's a very interesting. I had a feeling it was quite unique because anytime I've mentioned it to anyone who's from other countries, they're like, "What independence? Like, what are
Yeah, what's
these?"
an independent? Yeah.
Yeah, they couldn't grasp the concept. But referendums as well. Like, we're famous for having a lot of referendums. Is that something that's uniquely Irish as well?
Again, it's not uniquely Irish. In fact, if anybody was probably going to be identified with referendums, it's our Swiss colleagues. The Swiss have many more referendums. They have hundreds of referendums. But we are a big user of referendums, and especially in about the last kind of 15 to 20 years. They were relatively rare kind of at the start. After the Constitution was adopted in 37, there were only a very small number of them. But then when we get to the 1990s, they start to increase in frequency. And so we have a very particular type of referendum, which is a kind of a national referendum, which is required to change the Constitution. And so that's the only circumstance in which we hold referendums, and it's required by the Constitution. But the reason we have so many is because we have a quite expansive Constitution. And so the Constitution was drafted in the 1930s. And so the bits that kind of everybody are aware of, the fact that there was a lot of description in there about kind of Catholic social teaching and how society should be structured. And of course, most of that became quite outdated, actually long outdated ever before we got around to changing a lot of it, and so in the 1980s and 90s we start that process of updating some of the wording around those clauses. But I think sometimes we don't talk enough about the fact that it's also very detailed when it comes to how the institutions of the state work, and the courts, for example, and the nature of sovereignty. And so if we've had a lot of kind of technical referendums in relation to things like we tried to bring in parliamentary inquiries, the Oireachtas Inquiries referendum in 2011, that actually failed. There was an effort to abolish the upper house of parliament, the Seanad, that also failed. We've had successful ones in relation to courts, introducing new courts. I forget which ones we brought in, and we have one actually upcoming on the International Patent Court, which we've been supposed to hold for years actually, but anyway, it will have to be held to a referendum. So the bail referendum, these are technical referendums that we have to have because the Constitution is so detailed about how the state operates and how the state should be run. Interestingly, voters tend to be very reluctant around changing kind of the technical aspects of the Constitution. So, and again, we're circling back to where we started in relation to the presidential election and all that talk in the last couple of weeks about whether there'd be a referendum to change the nomination process. One, I think that's highly unlikely. But the second thing is, if we had it, I think it'd be even more unlikely that it would pass, because we had a referendum to reduce the age at which somebody could become a candidate for the presidential election about 10 years ago. And that was defeated by a huge majority at the time. So you have to be 35 to become a candidate at the presidential election. We wanted to reduce that 21, and the electorate said no. Well, almost 70% of the electorate said no. So voters tend to be very careful about changing the kind of structures and rules of the political system. But we do have a lot of referendums. We have them on European treaties because that is arising from a judgment a couple of decades ago in relation to the nature of sovereignty, and the interpretation was that further European integration affects our sovereignty, so that has to be decided by the voters every time. And I think we've gotten better at holding referendums as well. I mean, one of the things about referendums, I think it's important, countries either should have like lots of them or they should have none, really. And I think we've gotten used to having lots of them. So we have a kind of a sense of how referendums work, why we have referendums, but also importantly that referendums are a decision at a point in time. They're the view of the public now on this particular issue. But sometimes the public changes their mind. And so we voted 6 times on abortion. We 6 separate questions on abortion. We had multiple referendums on divorce, and some of the EU treaties, we voted on again. So like referendums are a decision, they're accepted, but there's also a sense that actually people change their minds on things, and so then we can have another referendum on it, and we see what people think the next time. And I think in countries that have referendums infrequently, kind of referendums takes on kind of these outsized importance, like, you know, the referendum on something is kind of a sign from God that this is the view and the destiny of the country forever. I'm thinking here, of course, specifically about Brexit, you know, and but like we don't referendums, because we have started to have so many of them. I think we've become much better at understanding that referendums intersect with our other electoral events. And if voters, you know, vote for somebody at the next election who have a very different view, well, then it's a totally legitimate thing to say, well, do voters still think this about the referendum question, and maybe we should revisit it, or maybe we should think about it again. And so I think that's the strength of having frequent ones, is you come to understand them as part of a process and part of a wider kind of ecosystem of democracy. They're unusual. I mean, we have a lot of them in comparison to other countries. Ourselves and Italy kind of come together behind Switzerland, but some countries have almost no referendums at all. And so they're unusual, but I think they're kind of an embedded feature, and I think people like to be asked about their views on things.
Yeah, and I like to think that having a referendum makes you more politically engaged. When you're voting for candidates in elections, you're kind of thinking about the candidate, okay, whatever they might action things that either you do or don't disagree with. But when you're voting on a question and it might be something that directly impacts you, say some of our more like socially inclined referendums, like the abortion referendum mentioned, or the marriage equality referendum, these were huge discussions, talking points. And I think for a lot of people, particularly younger people that hadn't yet become politically engaged, these were almost like the gateways for them to begin becoming politically engaged. So I think in a way, yeah, it's I feel like it feels like a very nice aspect of Irish society to have those big questions every so often. Just to go back to the presidential election again, I've seen a few different discussions on this, but I'm curious what your thoughts might be. Why do you think that we vote or tend to vote for left of centre presidents, but yet our government is usually right of centre?
But I suppose I probably should start by saying we didn't always vote for left of centre presidents. We voted somewhat recently for left of centre presidents, but I think when we look at the presidency as a whole, we would say people vote for candidates in presidential elections. Certainly since the 1990s, they vote for really eminent people, actually, you know, who are very impressive and who come through these grueling, awful presidential elections and kind of emerge unscathed at the other side. But I think it's the presidential election itself is a very candidate centered election. Now, it's not disconnected from political parties. Political parties are part of that, and certainly some political parties, or their candidates kind of tend to get like either the core vote or maybe a little bit with it. But I think when parties are choosing candidates, they're thinking about them not just as kind of getting their party voters, but as having a wider appeal to a wider group of the electorate. And I think that's the thing we see with the kind of candidates who've been successful in recent elections. They were able to transcend their own party appeal to have a wider appeal to the electorate. And so, you know, you saw that with Catherine Connolly, Michael D. Higgins, but also with Mary McAleese, who was very much a party candidate. She was associated with Fianna Fáil, but she won a wider vote than just the party. But I think what kind of all of these people, Mary Robinson, have together is that they're really impressive people. And they were candidates with really significant personal track records that they were able to communicate and share, and kind of very developed views of what they wanted to do as president, I think is also very important. And the other thing is they're really skilled politicians. You know, all these people are, you know, politicians. And I was speaking to an international journalist quite recently, and they were like, oh, you know, how come you ended up with these candidates in the end? Because I thought everybody wanted somebody from outside of politics. And I was like, you know, this happens at every single presidential election. We have 3 months of speculation about how what the public really want actually is somebody from outside of politics. What they really want is some kind of political neophyte who has done marvelous things in another sphere. And there's all these kind of like I don't know, presentation of notions. And do you know what they are? That's what is notions. Because actually, if you look at what Irish voters have voted for and who they have voted for and who they have chosen to be as president, they're all from within the political system. They're all either immensely experienced politicians or people who sit at that intersection of law and politics and constitutional affairs. And actually, there's no sense anywhere that there is a large majority of Irish people who want to pick some person, however impressive they may be, but from outside of the political system, because presidential elections are actually the most intensely political elections of all of the elections. And so, now you have a kind of a former Lasca here, look of the Dáil, who had been a barrister in the Dáil for 10 years more. Michael D. Higgins, former government minister, somebody decades of experience. Mary McAleese is sometimes presented as somebody who wasn't really very involved in politics, but of course she had stood as a candidate for Fianna Fáil previously. She'd been a journalist with Prime Time, and she's somebody who had been kind of involved in political fora in Northern Ireland and in the Republic quite extensively before she ran for president. So the idea that she was a political newbie, and I don't want to detract from her exceptional political skills, but the presidential election wasn't her first day out. So a lot of the sense really is, a lot of the talk before presidential elections is that people want somebody who's kind of different and from outside. But actually, when push comes to shove and we see the votes fall into the ballot boxes, what they want are really experienced and impressive people who have done important things in their political careers.
I agree with you. I also think you mentioned that how grueling the presidential campaign is. And especially when there's less candidates, there's going to be more of a focus on whoever is running. I do think those who have those years of political experience, it really comes in and helps them out, because like the questions they have to answer, the debates they have to do, the amount of interviews, just the sheer stamina that they need, and the amount of media training. When someone's coming in from that outside without that political experience, they're starting off on the back foot.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. Like the experience of being a politician is very different to being somebody who appears in the media, as an expert, or as somebody who comes in, on behalf of a civil society organization. Like if you're in the media and you're somebody who's kind of like me, you're on to talk about elections, and they ask me about something, I don't know, agriculture, I smile and say, well, that's interesting, but I don't know anything about agriculture. But when you're a politician, you can't do that. When you're a politician, you have to know something about everything. You have to have your party position. You have to say what's happening in Europe today, or what's happening in the Dáil, and where is this at, and you have to be able to answer questions. You don't have the luxury of saying, that's not my area now, so I can't talk about that. And I think that sometimes that kind of difference isn't fully appreciated, that when you were a politician, there is an intense scrutiny that comes with all of your work, and it's so wide, and that is just, it's not a skill that you can learn over the course of a presidential campaign. That is a skill that you hone and develop over a career. And the other thing is, it's a skill. Like this is not, something that should be ignored. It is a particularly valuable and important ability, and it's one that we expect all of our politicians to have, and it's one that we expect our president to have in spades.
Yeah, absolutely agree. So, Teresa, the final question. What does it mean to be Irish?
For me, it's all about politics. It's about, it's about being from an old and proud democracy. That's what it is to be Irish. It's being in a country that's had the luxury of having free elections for 100 years. And it's so unusual. When we look around the world, so few countries can say that they've been democracies continuously for 100 years. It's only a handful that fall into that space. Most of our near European neighbours experienced either short, or for our Central and Eastern European neighbours, very long periods of oppression and dictatorship. And so to be Irish is to live in a free and open democracy, and in a place where we are really close to our politicians, and we have amazing access to the, to share, to say what we think, and to have that heard. And so, yeah, I think we spend a lot of time complaining about our political system, but it has a great many strengths.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you very much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it. Gur míle míle maith agat.
You're very welcome.
Thanks a million for tuning in to today's interview with Dr. Theresa Reidy. I hope you enjoyed that one as much as I did. If you did enjoy it, you can share a bit of content on your Instagram story. You can share this, the link to whatever you listen to it on, whether it's Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts. And yeah, throw it into a group chat or two if you know there's a few people who enjoy this kind of stuff. I would appreciate that. And I will see you next time very soon for our next episode. Gur míle míle maith agam, and I hope that you have a fantastic rest of your day.